Galactic Council attacks. A human diplomat. Unaware, he is death in disguise. The massive crystalline spire of the Galactic Council stretched endlessly into the purple sky of Nexus Prime, its translucent walls humming with the conversations of 1,000 species. Ambassador Marcus Chen walked through the gleaming corridors with measured steps, his simple black diplomatic robes a stark contrast to the elaborate costumes worn by the alien delegates around him. His unremarkable appearance drew curious glances from creatures with scales, feathers, and bioluminescent patches, but none suspected the true nature of the being moving among them. Marcus had served as Earth's primary diplomat for nearly a decade, and in that time he had earned a reputation for being unnaturally calm in the face of crisis. What the council members didn't know was that calmness came from an ancient understanding of finality that stretched back to the dawn of consciousness itself. He was not merely human, though he wore that form like a comfortable suit. He was something far older, something that had walked beside every sentient being in their final moments since time began. The emergency session had been called by the Zephyrian Empire, a militaristic species known for their aggressive expansion policies. Their delegate, General Vextar, stood nearly 3 meters tall with chitinous armor that gleamed under the chamber's artificial lighting. His 4 arms gestured dramatically as he addressed the assembled council, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "The human expansion must be stopped," Vextar declared, his mandibles clicking with agitation. "Their colonies spread like a plague across the outer rim. They terraform worlds without regard for existing ecosystems. They negotiate with species we have rightfully conquered. This cannot continue." Marcus listened from his designated seat in the human section, his dark eyes reflecting nothing of the amusement he felt. The Zephyrians had indeed conquered many species, but their definition of rightful conquest was rather flexible. He had been present at the end of many Zephyrian campaigns, walking among the battlefields where their victims lay dying. Each time, he had seen the fear in their compound eyes as they realized their time had come. The Altarian delegate, a crystalline being whose body chimed softly with each movement, raised a limb in support. "The humans show no respect for established boundaries," she sang in harmonious tones. "They claim worlds that have been marked for Altarian expansion for centuries." Marcus almost smiled at that statement. The Altarians had a peculiar habit of marking worlds by simply pointing their telescopes at them and declaring intent. They had never actually traveled to most of these worlds, lacking the technology for long-distance space travel. Humanity's crime was being more efficient at actually reaching these distant stars. As the accusations mounted, Marcus remained perfectly still. He had learned long ago that patience was the greatest weapon in his arsenal. Death, after all, was never in a hurry. It arrived precisely when it was meant to, neither early nor late. The irony of these powerful beings demanding action against humanity while unknowingly sitting in the presence of their greatest fear was not lost on him. The Valdorian representative, a slug-like creature with iridescent skin, oozed forward on his platform. "Perhaps negotiation would be more appropriate," he suggested diplomatically. "The humans have proven reasonable in past discussions." General Vextar's head snapped toward the Valdorian with predatory focus. "Reasonable? They refuse to acknowledge our territorial claims. They refuse to pay tribute to established powers. They act as though they belong among the great civilizations of this galaxy when they have barely left their home system." This was technically true. Humanity had only been traveling the stars for 50 years. A mere blink of an eye compared to civilizations that had been spacefaring for millennia. What these ancient races failed to understand was that sometimes youth brought advantages that age could not match. Humans approached problems with fresh perspectives, unencumbered by the weight of tradition or the fear of change. Marcus stood slowly, drawing the attention of the chamber. When he spoke, his voice carried across the vast space without technological amplification, each word clear and precise. Honored delegates, I believe there may be some misunderstanding about human intentions. We seek only peaceful coexistence and mutual benefit through trade and cultural exchange. Vextar's laugh was a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the crystalline walls. Peaceful coexistence. Your species has established military outposts on 17 worlds in the last year alone? Defensive positions only, Marcus replied calmly. Necessary given the increasing pirate activity in those sectors. The general's forearms spread wide in a gesture of dismissal. Pirates that conveniently disappear whenever human ships arrive. How suspicious. Marcus tilted his head slightly, a gesture that seemed merely polite but carried deeper meaning for those who knew how to read such signs. Are you suggesting that human forces are somehow connected to these criminal activities? I am suggesting, Vexatar said, his voice dropping to a menacing growl, that humanity's expansion threatens the stability of this entire region. The Council has been patient, but our patience has limits. The chamber fell silent as the implications of those words sank in. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing the tone of an ultimatum. Marcus, however, remained completely still, his breathing so controlled it was barely perceptible. The Nexari delegate, a floating gaseous being contained within an environmental suit, spoke in a voice like whispered wind. What exactly are you proposing, General? Vextar's compound eyes fixed on Marcus as he delivered his answer. Economic sanctions, travel restrictions, and if necessary, military intervention to contain human expansion. Marcus felt a familiar stirring in the depths of his consciousness, like distant thunder on a clear day. The Council was discussing actions that would lead to suffering on a massive scale. Innocent civilians would die, children would starve, the weak would be consumed by the strong, as they had been throughout galactic history. I must respectfully disagree with the General's assessment, Marcus said, rising from his seat. Humanity has violated no established treaties. We have attacked no sovereign territory. We have acted only in self-defense against hostile forces. Vexatar leaned forward on his platform, his massive form casting a shadow across the chamber floor. Self-defense? Your military capabilities suggest otherwise. The destruction of the Carax pirate fleet was thorough. Marcus nodded acknowledgement. Pirates who had been raiding civilian convoys for months, the same pirates who your forces claimed to be hunting but never seemed to find. The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Several delegates exchanged glances, realizing they were witnessing something more significant than a simple territorial dispute. The Carax incident had indeed been mysterious. An entire pirate armada had simply vanished overnight, leaving only debris fields and distress signals that cut off mid-transmission. General Vextar's chitinous armor began to shimmer with aggressive bioluminescence, a clear sign of rising anger among his species. You accuse the Zephyrian Empire of incompetence? I accuse no one of anything, Marcus replied with infinite patience. I merely point out that different species have different approaches to problem-solving. The statement was diplomatically perfect and utterly infuriating. Vextar's forearms clenched into fists, and Marcus could sense the general's barely contained fury. Around the chamber, other delegates began to show signs of unease. The Thraxian delegation huddled together, their insectoid forms clicking nervously. The Oceanic Collective's representative retreated deeper into their aquatic environment suit. Marcus understood their fear. Violence was about to erupt in a chamber designed for peaceful discourse, and everyone present could feel it building like pressure in a sealed container. But he also understood something else. Something that would have terrified these beings if they had possessed the knowledge to comprehend it. He was not the victim in this scenario. When Vexatar finally moved, it was with the lightning speed of a predator striking prey. His massive form launched across the chamber, 4 arms extended toward Marcus with claws that could tear through steel. The moment General Vextar's claws made contact with Marcus Chen's diplomatic robes, reality itself seemed to pause. The massive Zephyrian warrior, mid-leap and fully committed to his attack, suddenly found himself frozen in the air as if time had stopped flowing around him. His 4 arms were extended, claws gleaming with deadly intent, but they moved no closer to their target. Marcus looked up at the suspended general with something approaching disappointment. "That was unwise," he said quietly, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent chamber despite its soft tone. What happened next would be debated in xenopsychology textbooks for generations. The air around Marcus began to shimmer, not with heat distortion, but with something far more profound. Shadows seemed to deepen despite the chamber's bright lighting, and several delegates found themselves inexplicably thinking of loved ones who had passed away years before. The transformation was subtle at first. Marcus's unremarkable features remained the same, but something fundamental shifted in his presence. The diplomatic robes he wore began to ripple as if moved by unfelt winds, and his dark eyes took on a depth that seemed to contain infinite distances. When he raised his hand toward the frozen Zephyrian, his movements carried the weight of inevitability itself. "You have made a grave error, General," Marcus continued, and now his voice resonated with harmonics that shouldn't have been possible from a human throat. "You have attacked a diplomatic envoy during peaceful negotiations. More importantly, you have attacked someone who has been far more patient with your threats than you deserve." Around the chamber, delegates began to realize they were witnessing something unprecedented. The Altarian representative's crystalline form chimed discordantly as waves of unease passed through her structure. The Valdorian ambassador had retreated as far as his platform allowed, his usually confident demeanor replaced by primitive terror. Marcus gestured casually, and Vextar dropped to the chamber floor with a thunderous crash that cracked the crystal surface beneath him. The general scrambled to his feet, confusion and rage warring in his compound eyes. "What kind of technology is this?" he demanded, his 4 arms spread defensively. "What weapons do you carry?" "No weapons," Marcus replied, beginning to walk slowly toward the Zephyrian. With each step, the shadows seemed to follow him, pooling around his feet like liquid darkness. No technology, simply truth. The Nexari delegate's environmental suit began flashing warning lights as its occupant's gaseous form writhed in apparent distress. "This is impossible," the whispered voice emerged from the suite's speakers. "Humans don't possess psychic abilities." Marcus paused in his approach, turning to address the floating being. "You're quite correct. Humans don't possess such abilities." He smiled then, and several delegates felt their species' evolutionary equivalent of ice forming in their veins. "But I am not entirely human." The revelation hung in the air like a physical presence. General Vextar, despite his size and warrior training, took an involuntary step backward. "What are you?" he demanded, though his voice now carried undertones of uncertainty. "I am something that has existed since the first sentient being drew breath in this universe," Marcus answered, his form beginning to shift in ways that defied optical physics. His human appearance remained intact, but somehow he seemed larger, more imposing, as if his presence extended beyond the boundaries of his physical form. "I am the final appointment every living creature must eventually keep. I am the ending that gives meaning to every story." The Thraxian delegation erupted in rapid clicking, their hive mind processing the implications faster than individual consciousness could manage. Their translation device struggled with concepts that didn't exist in their language, finally settling on approximations that made several other delegates gasp in recognition. "Death," whispered the Oceanic Collective's representative, the word bubbling through their aquatic environment. You claim to be death itself. Marcus nodded slowly. Not claim, simply state fact. For 10 years I have served as Earth's ambassador, walking among you, learning your cultures, your strengths, your weaknesses. Do you know why? General Vextar's aggressive posture was crumbling as instinctual fear overrode his military conditioning. You're lying. Death isn't a person. It's a concept, a natural process. Is it? Marcus asked, and suddenly the chamber was filled with whispers only the delegates could hear. Voices of their ancestors, their deceased family members, their fallen comrades. Each being present heard something different, but all heard the unmistakable sound of finality. Every species in this galaxy has stories about death taking physical form. The Zephyrian Black Wing, the Altarian Song of Ending, the Valdorian Silent Tide. How interesting that such diverse cultures would develop such similar myths. The Altarian delegate's harmonic chiming became discordant as she processed this information. The convergent mythology theorem, she sang in shaking tones. Similar stories across unconnected cultures suggest a common source. Very good, Marcus acknowledged. And what would that common source be? Around the chamber, advanced civilizations that had mastered faster-than-light travel, quantum computing, and genetic engineering found themselves confronted with a truth their science couldn't explain. The being they had invited to negotiate trade agreements and territorial boundaries was something that existed outside their understanding of natural law. General Vextar made one final attempt at defiance, raising his forearms in a combat stance. I don't care what you claim to be. You're still in a physical form. You can still be destroyed. Marcus regarded the general with something approaching pity. Can I? Have you ever wondered why humanity has been so successful in such a short time? Why our expansion has proceeded so smoothly despite facing opposition from species with millennia of experience? The question hung unanswered as delegates began connecting dots they had previously ignored. Human colonies that were attacked by pirates always survived with minimal casualties. Human diplomatic missions succeeded even when facing overwhelming cultural barriers. Human exploration vessels found resources with remarkable frequency. You've been guiding us, breathed the Valdorian ambassador, his iridescent skin cycling through colors associated with awe and terror. Protecting us. Helping, Marcus corrected. Humanity earned their successes through courage, ingenuity, and determination. I simply ensured they had the opportunity to demonstrate these qualities. He turned back to Vextar, who was now visibly trembling despite his warrior conditioning. The question now becomes, what happens to species that threaten my chosen people? The chamber erupted in chaos as delegates frantically attempted to distance themselves from the Zephyrian general. Platforms scattered in every direction as beings that had ruled star systems for thousands of years suddenly found themselves face to face with something beyond their comprehension. Vextar stood alone in the center of the chamber, his chitinous armor gleaming with stress-induced bioluminescence. Your chosen people? He managed to croak. Marcus nodded, his human facade beginning to slip more noticeably. The shadows around him deepened, and his eyes reflected light in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Every species eventually faces extinction. The aftermath of the revelation rippled through the Galactic Council chamber like waves through still water. Where moments before there had been the confident posturing of ancient civilizations, now there was only stunned silence and the occasional nervous whisper between delegates. General Vexatar remained on the floor, his massive frame reduced to trembling submission as he stared up at the being he had attempted to attack. Marcus Chen walked slowly around the chamber, his footsteps echoing in the crystalline space with unusual resonance. The shadows that had gathered around him during his transformation began to recede, but they didn't disappear entirely. Instead, they seemed to settle into the corners of the room like patient sentinels, reminding everyone present of what they had witnessed. I understand this revelation may be difficult to process, Marcus said, his tone returning to the measured diplomacy that had characterized his decade of service. Change often is, but I want to be clear about something important. He stopped walking and faced the assembled delegates directly. Despite his human appearance having largely returned to normal, none of the beings present would ever again see him as merely another species representative. I am not your enemy, he continued. I have never been your enemy. For billions of years, I have served the natural order, ensuring that all things end when their time comes. I take no pleasure in suffering. I find no joy in conquest. I simply am what I am, as gravity simply is what it is. The Altarian delegate's crystalline form began to chime softly, a sound associated with deep contemplation among her species. Then why reveal yourself now? She asked, her harmonic voice carrying overtones of genuine curiosity rather than fear. Why abandon your disguise? Marcus smiled, and this time the expression carried warmth instead of the terrifying implications of his earlier revelation. Because someone needed to learn an important lesson about consequences. His gaze shifted to General Vextar, who was slowly attempting to regain his footing. The massive Zephyrian's 4 arms shook with the effort. Whether from physical exertion or lingering terror, none could say. The Zephyrian Empire has built its power through intimidation and violence, Marcus observed. For centuries you have expanded by crushing smaller civilizations, enslaving populations, and claiming resources that belong to others. You succeeded because you were stronger, more advanced, more ruthless than those you conquered. Vextar finally managed to stand, though he swayed unsteadily. We followed the laws of survival. The strong rule the weak. It is the natural order. Is it? Marcus asked, tilting his head with apparent interest. Tell me, General, how many Zephyrian children have died in your wars of expansion? How many families were torn apart by your conquests? How many promising young soldiers never returned home because you decided their lives were worth less than another star system? The questions hung in the air like accusations, each one striking with surgical precision. Around the chamber, delegates who had either allied with or feared the Zephyrian Empire began to see them in a different light, not as inevitable conquerors, but as bullies who had never faced true opposition. Every species has made difficult choices, Vextar said, but his voice lacked conviction. Survival requires sacrifice. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. True. And now you face such a choice. You can continue on your current path, escalating threats against humanity and their allies, in which case you will discover exactly how creative I can become when protecting something I value. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop several degrees, and more than one delegate shivered despite their environmental controls. Or, Marcus continued, his tone brightening, you can learn from this experience. You can choose to become something better than what you have been. The Valdorian ambassador oozed forward slightly on his platform, his iridescent skin cycling through colors of cautious hope. What exactly are you suggesting? Cooperation instead of conquest, Marcus replied. The Zephyrian Empire possesses advanced military technology and organizational skills. Humanity brings innovation, adaptability, and fresh perspectives. Other species contribute their own unique strengths. Imagine what could be accomplished if all that potential was directed toward creation rather than destruction. The concept was so radically different from the standard galactic power structure that several delegates needed time to process it. The idea of voluntary cooperation between species, rather than domination hierarchies, challenged fundamental assumptions about how civilizations interacted. The Oceanic Collective's representative spoke from within their aquatic environment suit. The resource allocation algorithms would be incredibly complex. How would territorial boundaries be determined? Trade agreements? Military responsibilities? The same way humans solve any complex problem, Marcus answered. Through discussion, compromise, and trial and error. Not every solution will be perfect, but most will be better than the alternatives. General Vextar's compound eyes focused on Marcus with what might have been confusion. You speak of cooperation as though it were simple. Different species have incompatible needs, conflicting goals, resource requirements that cannot be shared. Do they? Marcus asked. Or do they have different methods of meeting fundamentally similar needs? He gestured toward the chamber around them. This council exists because someone recognized that talking was more efficient than fighting. You just lost sight of the original purpose. The Nexari delegates' gaseous forms swirled within their containment suit as they processed this observation. The historical records do indicate that the council was originally formed as an alternative to the galactic wars of the Third Epoch. Exactly, Marcus confirmed. And it worked. For nearly 2,000 years, major interstellar conflicts were resolved through negotiation rather than warfare. Only recently have various factions begun returning to the old ways of solving problems through violence. The implications of his words settled over the assembly like a blanket of uncomfortable truth. The galaxy had known peace, and they had abandoned it for the familiar comfort of might-makes-right politics. Marcus walked back to his original position, his diplomatic robe settling around him with normal, non-supernatural physics. I am offering you all a choice. You can continue down the path that leads to inevitable conflict, resource depletion, and the eventual extinction of multiple civilizations. Or you can choose to evolve. And if we refuse? Vexatar asked, though his voice suggested he didn't really want to hear the answer. Marcus's smile was gentle, but his eyes reflected depths that reminded everyone present exactly what he represented. Then I will do what I have always done. I will ensure that all things end when their time comes. The difference is, you now get to choose whether that time arrives through wisdom or through foolishness. The silence that followed was profound. Thousands of years of galactic politics, millions of beings' futures, and the trajectory of entire civilizations hung in the balance of what happened next in this crystalline chamber. Finally, the Altarian delegate began to chime a complex harmonic pattern that her translation device rendered as formal diplomatic language. The Altarian Collective requests permission to withdraw our territorial claims against human settlements in Sector 7. The Valdorian ambassador's colors shifted to those associated with agreement. The Valdorian Republic seconds this motion and further proposes the establishment of joint research initiatives with human scientific institutions. One by one, the other delegates began speaking, offering concessions, proposing cooperation agreements, and fundamentally restructuring their relationships with humanity. Not out of fear alone, though fear was certainly present, but out of recognition that they had been offered something unprecedented. A chance to choose their future rather than have it imposed upon them. General Vextar was the last to speak. The massive warrior stood silently for long minutes, his forearms hanging at his sides as he struggled with concepts that challenged everything he had believed about strength and survival. "The Zephyrian Empire," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "requests a formal treaty of non-aggression with the human alliance and—" He paused, the words clearly difficult to form. "We offer to share our defensive technologies in exchange for access to human agricultural innovations." Marcus nodded approvingly. "An excellent beginning. I believe this will be the start of something remarkable." As the delegates began discussing the practical details of their new cooperative framework, Marcus Chen stood quietly in his section of the chamber. To any observer, he appeared to be exactly what he claimed. Earth's diplomatic representative, taking notes on the proceedings and preparing his report for the human government. But in the shadows that still lingered around the edges of the crystalline chamber, something ancient and patient smiled with satisfaction. Change had come to the galaxy not through conquest or force, but through the simple recognition that all beings, no matter how powerful, must eventually face the same fundamental truth. And sometimes, if they were very wise, they could choose how that truth manifested in their lives. The universe had just become a more interesting place, and Death was quite pleased with the development. It is the natural order. But humanity intrigues me. They face death not with acceptance or resignation, but with defiance. They rage against the dying of the light. They refuse to go quietly into that final night. The philosophical implications hit the assembled delegates like a physical blow. They were witnessing not just a revelation about the nature of death, but about humanity's unique relationship with mortality itself. So when beings like yourself threaten humanity's future, Marcus continued, stepping closer to the increasingly terrified general, you threaten something I find precious, something I am quite motivated to protect. General Vextar's legs finally gave out, and he collapsed to the cracked crystal floor. Around him, the most powerful beings in the galaxy watched as their understanding of existence fundamentally shifted. Marcus looked around the chamber at the cowering delegates, his expression returning to the mild, diplomatic demeanor he had worn for 10 years. Now then, he said pleasantly, I believe we were discussing territorial boundaries. Perhaps we could approach that conversation with a bit more civility? The attack was so sudden, so unexpected in this place of diplomacy, that several delegates cried out in shock and alarm. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't duck or dodge or attempt to flee. He simply stood there, watching the general's approach with the same calm expression he had worn throughout the debate. To the observers, it looked like a small human was about to be torn apart by a creature 3 times his size and weight. They were about to discover just how wrong that assumption was.